She didn't ask for help, she just needed a signal strong enough to keep her going. The wind cut through Lily Bennett's thin sweater as she sat on the cold concrete just outside the cafe's wide glass window, her fingers hovering over the worn keys of a laptop that had seen better years, the faint glow of the screen reflecting in her tired eyes while inside, warm light spilled across polished wooden tables and the low hum of conversation drifted through the glass like a world she didn't belong to. She shifted slightly, adjusting the angle of her device as if chasing something invisible, one bar of Wi-Fi flickering, then disappearing, then returning just long enough for her to exhale and keep typing. The scent of fresh coffee curled into the chilly evening air each time the door opened, and every time it did, a wave of laughter followed, soft and effortless, so different from the quiet determination etched into her face. A small stroller rested beside her, its wheels locked in place, a faded blanket tucked carefully around a sleeping child whose tiny breaths rose and fell in a rhythm that seemed to steady her own. Lily glanced down for just a second, brushing her fingertips gently against the edge of the blanket before returning to her screen. The deadline sat heavy in her mind, a client expecting revisions by midnight, a payment she couldn't afford to lose, not when rent was due in 4 days and her checking account barely held enough to stretch through the week. She didn't step inside, never did, not because she wasn't allowed, but because she knew exactly how it would feel, the glances, the hesitation, the quiet calculation of whether she belonged among the people ordering $12 drinks without thinking twice, so she stayed outside, where the signal barely reached but pride still held its ground. Across the glass, unnoticed by her, a man stood still for a moment longer than necessary, his reflection blending with the cafe lights as his eyes settled on the figure just beyond the window. Ethan Cole had seen countless customers come and go, faces blurred into routine, but something about the girl outside didn't fade as easily. Maybe it was the way she leaned closer to the screen when the signal weakened, or how she never once looked up at the door as if expecting someone to invite her in. He watched as she paused, her hand still, waiting, the loading icon spinning on her screen, a small, silent battle playing out in front of him, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he didn't look away. Inside, someone called his name, a manager asking about inventory, a delivery schedule, things that usually demanded his full attention, but tonight, his focus lingered elsewhere, on the girl who borrowed what little signal reached the sidewalk and turned it into something that looked like survival. Lily exhaled slowly as the connection stabilized for a brief moment, her fingers moving quickly again, chasing time, chasing opportunity, chasing something just out of reach, and as the glow of the cafe lights wrapped around her silhouette from behind the glass, she looked less like someone asking for something and more like someone refusing to give up, even when the world barely noticed she was there. The cursor blinked like a quiet warning as Lily Bennett rubbed her eyes and leaned closer to the screen, the signal dipping again just as she tried to upload the final file, her breath catching for a second before she pressed retry, her fingers trembling not from the cold alone but from the weight of everything resting on that single submission. She glanced at the time in the corner of her screen, 9:42 p.m., less than 3 hours left. Inside the cafe the crowd had shifted, the evening rush softening into a calmer rhythm, couples leaning in close over half-finished drinks, laptops open on polished tables where ideas flowed as easily as the coffee, a world powered by comfort and stability, a world she used to believe she would be part of, before life had rewritten the plan without asking. She adjusted the thin blanket around her son again, careful not to wake him, his small hand curled loosely against his chest, peaceful in a way she could not afford to be. A sudden gust of wind slipped through the narrow street, biting against her skin and making her shoulders tense, but she stayed, always stayed, because leaving meant losing the connection, and losing the connection meant losing everything that came after it. Across the glass, Ethan Cole had not moved far, though his staff assumed he had returned to his office. Instead he stood partially hidden near the counter, his gaze drifting back to the same spot outside as if pulled by something he could not name. He noticed the small details now, things he had missed the first time, the way she never leaned against the window even when she was exhausted, as if respecting a boundary no one had asked her to keep, the way she checked on the child every few minutes with a softness that did not match the hardness of her situation, and the way she never once looked inside with envy, only focus, like everything she needed was already in front of her and she just had to reach it. He turned slightly as one of his employees approached, asking about closing procedures, but his answers came slower than usual. Distracted, his attention split between Responsibility and something quieter, something unfamiliar. Outside, Lily's screen froze again, this time longer, the loading bar stuck at 70%. She exhaled through her nose and pressed her lips together, refusing to let frustration take over. Not tonight. She opened another tab, switched to a lower resolution. Adjusted settings she had memorized through trial and error, small sacrifices to make the signal stretch just a little further, and then she waited, still, patient, as if patience itself was a skill she had mastered out of necessity. A group of teenagers passed by, laughing loudly, one of them glancing at her setup with a smirk before moving on, their voices fading into the distance, but Lily did not react. She had learned a long time ago that reacting cost energy she could not spare. Instead, she focused on the screen, on the blinking cursor, on the quiet promise that if she just held on a little longer, it might go through. Inside, Ethan watched as the progress bar inched forward. He could not see her screen, not clearly, but he could feel the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders held steady despite the strain. And without fully deciding to, he turned to the manager standing nearby and spoke in a low voice, something simple, almost casual, a request that would not draw attention, a change so small no one would question it, and seconds later, a router tucked behind the counter flickered, its signal quietly expanding beyond the usual boundary, stretching just a little further into the night air. Outside, Lily blinked as the connection suddenly steadied, the bar jumping from 70 to 90 in a breath. Her eyes widening slightly as she leaned closer, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever fragile moment had just appeared, and then, finally, the upload completed, the confirmation message lighting up her screen. She let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding, her shoulders relaxing for the first time that evening. And for a brief second, she closed her eyes, not in exhaustion, but in relief, unaware that behind the glass, someone had just made sure she would not lose everything tonight. Lily Bennett stared at the confirmation message for a moment longer than necessary, as if it might disappear if she blinked too quickly, then she finally allowed herself to lean back against the cold wall behind her, her body sinking into a brief, fragile sense of relief, the kind that never lasted long but still mattered. She reached down to gently adjust the blanket around her son again, her fingertips brushing his soft hair as he shifted slightly in his sleep, his small face calm despite the chill in the air. She smiled faintly, a quiet, private expression that no one inside the cafe could see, not that she expected anyone to notice. She had long grown used to being part of the background, something people passed by without a second glance, but tonight felt different, even if she could not explain why. Maybe it was the way the connection had suddenly held steady, or how the weight in her chest had eased just enough to let her breathe fully again. Inside, Ethan Cole remained near the counter, though his posture had changed, less distant now, more aware, his eyes still drifting toward the glass as if checking whether she would leave or stay. He noticed the subtle shift in her shoulders, the tension melting just slightly, and something about that small change settled uneasily in his mind, not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar, like a question he had not realized he needed to ask. He turned away briefly as a barista called out an order, the normal rhythm of the cafe continuing without pause, cups clinking, milk steaming, conversations rising and falling in soft waves. But even as he nodded absently at his staff, part of him remained fixed on the quiet scene just beyond the window. Outside, Lily closed her laptop carefully, almost ceremonially, as if acknowledging the importance of what had just been accomplished. She slipped it into her worn bag with practiced care, making sure the zipper did not catch, making sure nothing inside shifted too abruptly. Everything she owned seemed to exist in careful balance. One small mistake away from unraveling. She stood slowly, stretching her stiff legs, her joints protesting after hours on the cold ground, and for a second she hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the warm glow inside the cafe, not longing, not quite, but something close to it, something quieter, a memory of what comfort felt like. She shook it off gently and reached for the stroller. Unlocking the wheels and guiding it forward with steady hands, she did not look inside again, not even once, because she had learned that looking too long at something you could not have only made the distance feel wider. Inside, Ethan noticed her movement immediately, the subtle shift from stillness to departure, and without thinking, he stepped closer to the window, just enough to keep her in view as she began to walk down the sidewalk, her figure blending into the dim streetlights, pushing forward with a quiet determination that did not ask for recognition. He watched until she was nearly out of sight, something in his chest tightening in a way he did not expect. Not concern exactly, not curiosity alone, but something that lingered, something unresolved. He glanced back at the empty spot where she had been sitting. The cold concrete now just another piece of the sidewalk, as if she had never been there at all, but the absence felt noticeable, heavier than it should have been, and as he stood there, surrounded by warmth and light and everything he had built, Ethan realized that for the first time in a long while, his attention had been captured not by something inside his world, but by someone who had never stepped into it at all. The next morning arrived with a pale gray light that stretched slowly across the sidewalk, the kind of early hour where the city had not fully decided to wake up yet, and the air still carried a quiet stillness that felt almost fragile. Lily Bennett was already there, seated in the same spot outside the cafe, her laptop resting on her knees as she adjusted the angle slightly, searching for the strongest signal like she had done so many times before. Her son sat beside her this time, awake now. Bundled in the same worn blanket, his small fingers wrapped around the edge of a plastic toy that had clearly seen better days, he watched the world with curious eyes, occasionally glancing up at her as if measuring the rhythm of her focus. Lily offered him a soft smile before returning to her screen, her fingers moving steadily, not rushed, but purposeful, as if every keystroke carried weight. Inside the cafe, the morning shift had begun, the scent of fresh brewed coffee filling the space as employees moved efficiently behind the counter, preparing for the day ahead. Ethan Cole stood near the back, reviewing a report on his tablet, but his attention drifted sooner than he expected, almost instinctively, his gaze lifting toward the glass before he even realized why, and there she was again, exactly where she had been the night before, as if she had never left, the same quiet determination, the same careful distance, the same unspoken boundary she refused to cross. He paused, lowering the tablet slightly as he observed the scene, noticing something new this time. The child was awake, small, alert, looking around with the kind of openness that had not yet learned hesitation. Ethan watched as Lily shifted her laptop to one side just enough to reach into her bag, pulling out a small container. She opened it carefully, revealing what looked like a simple breakfast, a piece of toast cut into small squares. She handed one to her son, who accepted it with a quiet enthusiasm, his tiny smile breaking through the morning chill. She waited until he had taken a bite before picking up her laptop again, her priorities clear without needing explanation. Inside, one of the baristas approached Ethan with a question about inventory, but his response came delayed, his attention still divided. He found himself watching the interaction outside with a level of focus that felt unfamiliar, not because it was dramatic, but because it was not. There was no urgency, no demand. Just a quiet persistence that seemed to repeat itself day after day without complaint. Outside, Lily adjusted her position again as the signal flickered, her eyes narrowing slightly as she refreshed the page. The connection weaker this morning. She exhaled softly and leaned forward, trying to hold the signal in place long enough to continue. Her son reached toward her sleeve, tugging lightly. She paused immediately, turning her full attention to him, her expression softening as she brushed a crumb from his cheek, whispering something gentle that made him smile again. Then she returned to her work, the balance between responsibility and survival playing out in small, precise movements. Inside, Ethan felt something shift again, a quiet realization settling in. This was not coincidence, not a one-time moment of struggle, this was routine. This was her normal, and for reasons he could not fully articulate, that understanding stayed with him longer than anything else that morning. He glanced toward the router mounted discreetly behind the counter, then back to the window, and for the first time, he did not just observe her presence, he anticipated it, as if somewhere in his mind, the space outside the cafe had already begun to belong to her. By mid-morning, the sidewalk had grown busier, footsteps passing in steady rhythm as the city fully woke, but Lily Bennett remained in her small corner just outside the cafe window, her posture unchanged except for the slight shift of her shoulders as she leaned closer to her screen, the signal still unstable, weaker than the night before. She adjusted her laptop again, tilting it upward as if searching the air for something invisible. Her son had finished his breakfast and now sat quietly beside her, tapping his toy against the pavement in soft, uneven beats, occasionally glancing up at her as if checking whether she was still there, and each time she noticed, she answered with a small nod or a gentle smile before returning to her work, the balance between them silent but steady. Inside, Ethan Cole stood near the counter with a cup of coffee he had not touched, his attention drifting once again to the glass. It had become almost automatic now, this quiet check, this subtle awareness of whether she was still there. He noticed the way she kept adjusting her position, the signal clearly not holding, and for a brief moment, something like frustration flickered across her face before she smoothed it away, replacing it with the same calm focus he had seen before. He turned slightly, calling one of his staff over with a quiet gesture, his voice low enough not to carry. He asked about the outdoor signal range, about whether it could be extended without affecting the system inside. The employee hesitated, explaining limitations, technical constraints, policies that had always been in place. Ethan listened, nodding slowly. But his gaze shifted back to the window before the explanation finished, as if the answer mattered less than the situation itself. Outside, Lily refreshed her page again, her breath slowing as she waited, the loading icon spinning longer this time. She pressed her lips together and glanced briefly at the time, calculating silently, always calculating, how much longer she could stay, how much more she could complete before she had to move on. Her son tugged lightly at her sleeve again, this time pointing toward the cafe window, his eyes drawn to the pastries displayed inside, bright colors and soft textures that stood out against the gray morning. Lily followed his gaze for a second, her expression softening, not with longing, but with understanding. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small snack, offering it to him with a quiet reassurance, and he accepted it without complaint, his attention shifting back to the simple comfort she could provide. Inside, Ethan watched that moment closely, the exchange so small it could have been missed entirely, but it lingered, the way she redirected his attention without hesitation, without making him feel the absence of what he had pointed to. It was not just restraint, it was care. Intentional and practiced, and something about that settled deeper than he expected. He turned back to the employee still waiting for his response and gave a simple instruction, nothing dramatic, just a quiet decision framed as an adjustment, a minor upgrade to improve customer experience, something that would not raise questions, but would change everything just enough. Moments later, the signal outside shifted again, stronger now, more stable, extending just beyond the invisible line it had once respected. Outside, Lily paused as her screen responded instantly, the delay gone, the connection holding steady without her needing to adjust or reposition. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in quiet confusion, as if she had not expected things to work this easily. She hesitated for a second, then resumed typing, faster now, more fluid, her shoulders relaxing just enough to show the difference. And though she did not know why the signal had improved, she accepted it the same way she accepted everything else, without question, with gratitude she did not voice. Inside, Ethan finally lifted his coffee and took a slow sip, his gaze still resting on the scene outside, and for the first time, the distance between inside and outside felt just a little less absolute, as if something unseen had begun to bridge the gap. The steady connection changed the rhythm of Lily Bennett's work in a way she could feel almost immediately, her fingers moving with a smoother confidence across the keyboard, no longer pausing to wait for pages to load or files to save. The small interruptions that had once stretched every task into something exhausting were gone, replaced by a quiet flow that felt almost unfamiliar. She leaned forward slightly, her posture relaxing in subtle increments as the minutes passed, her son now fully awake beside her, watching the passing crowd with wide, curious eyes, occasionally pointing at something that caught his attention, a dog trotting past, a bright delivery truck, a man in a suit talking too loudly on his phone. Each time Lily followed his gaze for a second, acknowledging his world before returning to hers. A silent agreement between them that both of their needs mattered. Inside, the cafe had filled with the late morning rush, the line stretching toward the door as voices layered over one another in a busy hum, orders called out, machines hissing, cups sliding across the counter, and yet through all of it, Ethan Cole found his attention drifting back to the same place, the same figure just beyond the glass. It had become less of a question now and more of a habit, a quiet awareness that stayed with him even as he moved through his responsibilities. He noticed how quickly she adapted to the improved signal, how her movements had shifted from cautious to certain, and something about that response stayed with him, not just that she benefited from the change, but how naturally she used it, without hesitation, without suspicion. As if she had already accepted that any small advantage should be used fully before it disappeared. Outside, Lily paused briefly to stretch her fingers, flexing them one by one before returning to her work, her eyes scanning the screen with focus. She opened another project, then another, maximizing the time she had, stacking opportunity on top of opportunity in a way that spoke to more than just urgency. It spoke to discipline, to a quiet determination that had been built over time. Her son leaned gently against her side now, his energy softening into a calm stillness, comforted by her presence even as she worked. Lily adjusted her position slightly to support him without interrupting her flow, a small shift that showed how practiced she was at balancing both roles at once. Inside, Ethan moved toward the back office but stopped halfway. Turning instead to look at the window again, something about the scene outside refusing to leave his mind. He had seen people struggle before, had even helped in ways that were direct, visible, expected, but this felt different. There was no request, no acknowledgement, no transaction, just a quiet existence that continued regardless of whether anyone noticed. And that absence of expectation made every small action feel heavier, more intentional. He watched as Lily reached into her bag again. Pulling out a folded piece of paper, she glanced at it quickly, a list of some kind, then nodded to herself before returning to her screen, her expression focused, grounded, as if every decision she made followed a plan only she could see. Ethan exhaled slowly, setting his coffee down on the nearest surface without realizing it. His mind already moving ahead of him, considering not just what he had done, but what he could do next, not out of obligation, but out of something quieter, something that had begun to take shape the moment he first noticed her outside that window. And as the morning light shifted across the glass, blurring the line between inside and outside just enough to soften the contrast, Ethan realized that what had started as observation had become something else entirely, something closer to intention. Even if he had not yet decided what that intention would become. By early afternoon, the sunlight had shifted higher, casting a softer glow across the sidewalk where Lily Bennett remained seated, the warmth barely enough to take the edge off the lingering chill, but enough to make her loosen her grip on the tension she carried in her shoulders. Her laptop rested steady now, the connection holding without interruption, and for the first time in a long while, her work felt almost seamless, her fingers moving with a rhythm that matched her breathing, steady and controlled. Her son had grown restless beside her, his earlier calm giving way to the quiet energy of a child who had been still for too long. He shifted in his seat, tugging lightly at the edge of her sleeve. His attention drifting back toward the cafe window where movement and color seemed to promise something more interesting than the sidewalk. Lily noticed immediately, she always did. She paused her typing and turned fully toward him, her expression soft but attentive. She reached into her bag again, this time pulling out a small book, its corners worn and pages slightly bent. She opened it and placed it gently in his hands, guiding his attention away from the glass and toward something she could give him, something that belonged to their world. He accepted it with quiet curiosity, flipping through the pages as his focus shifted, and Lily returned to her work, the transition smooth, practiced, almost invisible. Inside, Ethan Cole stood near the counter, his arms folded loosely as he watched the exchange unfold. The simplicity of it striking him more than anything else. There was no hesitation, no frustration, just an immediate response shaped by understanding, and that understanding seemed to come from somewhere deeper than convenience. It came from repetition, from experience, from a life that had required her to adapt without pause. He noticed how she never allowed a moment to slip into discomfort, how she redirected it before it could grow, and something about that stayed with him, not just as observation, but as recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of a kind of strength he rarely saw in the spaces he usually occupied. One of the employees approached him again, this time asking about a minor scheduling issue, but Ethan's response came automatically, his attention still partially anchored to the scene outside. He nodded, gave a brief answer, and then stepped slightly closer to the window, not enough to draw attention, but enough to keep her in view. Outside, Lily's screen flickered briefly as a notification appeared. She paused, reading it carefully, her eyes scanning each line with growing focus. Then she sat up straighter, her posture shifting in a way that suggested something had changed. She opened another tab quickly, her fingers moving faster now, more urgent, but not panicked. Controlled urgency, the kind that came from opportunity rather than fear. Her son glanced up at her, sensing the change, and she reached out without looking, placing her hand gently on his shoulder, a silent reassurance that everything was still steady. inside. Ethan noticed the shift immediately, the subtle change in her energy, the way her focus sharpened. And he found himself wondering what had appeared on her screen, what kind of opportunity could alter her rhythm so quickly. He watched as she leaned closer, her entire attention drawn into that moment, and without realizing it, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not concern, not curiosity alone, but investment, a quiet interest in whether that moment would hold, whether it would carry her forward or slip away like so many other things probably had before. Outside, Lily's fingers paused for just a second as she read over the final line, then she nodded to herself, a small, decisive movement, and began typing again, faster now, more certain, as if she had just stepped into something that mattered, and as the afternoon light reflected softly across the glass between them, Ethan realized that he was no longer just observing her persistence, he was waiting to see where it would lead. The afternoon stretched into early evening with a slower rhythm, the sunlight fading into a softer glow that reflected off the cafe window like a quiet mirror, and Lily Bennett remained in her place, her focus unwavering as her fingers continued to move across the keyboard with a purpose that had only grown stronger since that notification had appeared. Whatever opportunity had found her, she was holding on to it with everything she had, her posture straighter now, her eyes sharper, scanning each line as if the smallest detail could make the difference between moving forward or falling behind again. Beside her, her son had grown quieter, the small book resting open in his lap as he leaned gently against her side, comforted by her presence even as she worked, his world small and secure within the space she created for him. Inside, the cafe had begun its subtle transition into evening, the rush fading into a more relaxed flow, conversations softer, lights warmer, and still, Ethan Cole found himself drawn back to the same place, the same quiet scene outside that had somehow become the most compelling part of his day. He noticed the change in her again, the way she leaned closer to the screen, the increased speed of her typing, the intensity that had replaced the earlier calm, and he understood without needing details that something had shifted, that she was not just working now, she was chasing something, and the difference mattered. He stepped closer to the window, just enough to see her more clearly, the reflection of the interior lights blending with the image of her outside, creating a faint overlap of two worlds that rarely touched. Outside, Lily paused suddenly, her fingers hovering above the keyboard as she read something carefully, her expression tightening for a brief second, not with fear, but with calculation. She scrolled back up, reread the message, then reached into her bag quickly, pulling out that folded paper again, her list. She compared the two, her eyes moving back and forth with quiet urgency, and then she exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that seemed to settle something inside her. She closed the paper and returned it to her bag, her decision made, her hands returning to the keyboard with renewed clarity. Inside, Ethan watched that moment unfold, the hesitation, the comparison, the decision, and something about it stayed with him more than anything else had. It was not just effort, it was strategy, it was discipline shaped by necessity. And it carried a weight he could not ignore. One of his employees approached him again, mentioning closing tasks, but Ethan barely registered the words, his attention fixed on the quiet determination playing out just beyond the glass. Outside, Lily's screen flickered again, but this time she did not adjust her position, she did not chase the signal, she trusted it, continuing her work with a steady confidence that had not been there before. Her son shifted slightly, resting his head against her arm, and without looking, she adjusted her position to support him, her hand briefly pausing on his shoulder before returning to the keyboard, the movement automatic, practiced, a balance she had learned to maintain without thinking. Inside, Ethan finally spoke again, his voice low but certain as he gave another quiet instruction. This time not about the signal, but something else, something small that would not draw attention, but would extend beyond the glass in a different way, something that would reach her without forcing her to step inside. And as the evening light dimmed and the boundary between inside and outside softened once more, Ethan realized that what had begun as observation had now become intention, not to interfere, not to intrude, but to quietly ensure that the moment she was chasing would not slip away, even if she never knew why. A few minutes later, something small shifted in Lily Bennett's world again, so subtle that anyone passing by would not have noticed it, but to her, it stood out immediately. The cafe door opened and one of the staff stepped outside, not toward her directly, but close enough to place a paper cup on the narrow ledge near the window, the movement casual, almost absent-minded, as if it had always been meant to be there. The employee turned and walked back inside without a word, without a glance. Leaving the cup behind, steam rising gently into the cooling air, Lily's fingers slowed, then stopped completely, her eyes lifting from the screen to the object now sitting just within her reach. She hesitated, her gaze lingering on it as if trying to understand whether it belonged to someone else, whether it had been left by mistake. Her instinct not to assume anything, not to take what was not clearly offered, she glanced briefly toward the door, but no one was looking, no one was watching in a way that made the gesture obvious. Inside, Ethan Cole stood still, his posture composed, his attention fixed on the reflection in the glass rather than the direct view, careful not to make his focus visible. He watched the hesitation, the quiet pause that stretched longer than expected, as if she was weighing more than just whether to take the cup. She was weighing dignity, boundaries, the invisible rules she had built around herself to navigate a world that did not always make space for her. Outside, Lily shifted slightly, her son noticing the cup before she did anything else, his eyes lighting up with curiosity. He reached toward it instinctively. But she gently placed her hand over his, stopping him, her expression soft but firm. A silent lesson passed in a single gesture. She leaned forward slowly, just enough to read the small marking on the side of the cup, no name, no receipt, nothing that tied it to a specific person, just a simple offering without explanation. She exhaled quietly, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction, and after a moment, she reached for it, her fingers wrapping around the warmth as if testing its reality. She lifted it carefully, bringing it closer, the scent of fresh coffee rising in a way that felt almost foreign to her. Not because she had never had it, but because she had not allowed herself to in a long time. She paused again, then lowered it slightly, her gaze shifting to her son, and without hesitation, she opened the lid just enough to let the steam escape before setting it aside, reaching instead into her bag to pull out a small bottle of water for him, prioritizing him without a second thought, the coffee remaining untouched for a few seconds longer. Inside, Ethan watched that choice, the sequence of actions playing out in a way that confirmed everything he had begun to understand about her. It was never about taking, it was about giving. Even when there was almost nothing left to give, he felt something settle in his chest again, heavier this time, not uncomfortable, but undeniable. Outside, Lily finally lifted the cup again, taking a small sip, her eyes closing for just a second as the warmth spread through her, not indulgent, not excessive, just enough to steady her. She lowered it and returned to her laptop. Her fingers moving once more, the moment passing quietly, seamlessly folding back into her routine, as if it had always been part of it. And as the evening air grew cooler and the light inside the cafe grew warmer, the distance between what was given and what was accepted felt smaller than it had before, even if no words had been exchanged. The warmth from the coffee lingered longer than Lily Bennett expected, not just in her hands but somewhere deeper, softening the edges of a day that had demanded so much from her. She did not drink it quickly, instead taking small, measured sips between lines of work, as if stretching the moment to last just a little longer. Her laptop screen reflected faintly in the cafe window behind it, the glow of two worlds overlapping in quiet contrast. Inside, the evening crowd had settled into a gentle rhythm, conversations quieter now, laughter softer, the kind of atmosphere that invited people to stay longer than they intended. Ethan Cole stood near the counter again, but this time his attention was not divided, it was anchored, steady. He watched as Lily continued to work, her movements consistent, her focus unbroken even as the night deepened around her. He noticed how she placed the empty coffee cup carefully beside her bag once it was finished, not leaving it behind, not treating it as something disposable, but as something that had been given, something that deserved acknowledgement. That detail stayed with him, small but significant. Outside, Lily checked the time again, the numbers on her screen reminding her of how long she had been there, how much she had accomplished, and how much still remained. Her son had grown quiet again, his head resting against her arm, his breathing slow, and even as sleep returned, she adjusted her position slightly, shifting the weight so he would remain comfortable, her movements instinctive, practiced. She had learned how to work around stillness without disturbing it. The city lights began to flicker on one by one, casting a softer glow across the sidewalk, the reflection in the cafe window growing stronger, blurring the line between inside and outside even more. Inside, one of the newer employees approached the window, glancing outside briefly before turning to Ethan with a slight frown, his voice low but audible enough. He mentioned that someone had been sitting out there all day again, that it might not look right, that customers could notice. Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, but something in his posture shifted, subtle but firm. He stepped closer to the window, his gaze following the employees for a moment before returning to Lily, still working, still focused, still asking nothing from anyone. He turned back slowly, his voice calm, measured, as he responded, explaining that the sidewalk did not belong to the cafe, that as long as she was not causing any disruption, there was no reason to interfere. His tone left no room for argument, but it was not harsh, just certain. The employee nodded and stepped away, the concern dissolving as quickly as it had appeared. Outside, Lily remained unaware of the brief conversation, her world still centered on the glow of her screen and the steady rhythm of her work. She paused for a moment, glancing down at her son, brushing a strand of hair away from his forehead, her expression softening in a way that seemed to reset her entirely. Then she returned to her task, her fingers moving once more with quiet determination. Inside, Ethan watched that small moment, the way she shifted from focus to care and back again without hesitation. And something about it settled fully in his mind. This was not temporary, this was not a single difficult day, this was her reality. And as the night deepened and the cafe lights grew warmer against the glass, Ethan realized that what he had started quietly, almost without thinking, was no longer something he could step away from, because now he understood not just what she was doing, but why she refused to stop. The night settled deeper around Lily Bennett, the air growing colder as the last wave of customers inside the cafe began to thin, the once lively hum softening into a quieter rhythm of closing routines and low conversations. But outside, she remained in her place, her focus unwavering despite the fatigue that had begun to press into her shoulders, her eyes slightly heavier now, blinking slower between lines of text. Yet her hands did not stop, they continued moving with the same quiet persistence that had carried her through the entire day. Beside her, her son slept soundly, his small body curled gently under the blanket, completely unaware of the hours passing, completely trusting the presence beside him to keep everything steady. Lily adjusted the edge of the blanket once more, careful not to disturb him, her touch light, almost instinctive. Then she returned to her screen, her breath steady as she pushed through the final stretch of work. Inside, Ethan Cole stood near the back of the cafe, reviewing the closing checklist with one of his managers, but his attention was divided in a way he no longer tried to hide from himself. Every few moments, his gaze drifted back toward the window, toward the quiet figure that had somehow become the center of his awareness without ever stepping inside. He noticed the subtle signs of exhaustion now, the way her posture leaned just a fraction more forward, the way her shoulders did not fully relax even during pauses, and something about that shift stirred a quiet urgency in him, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but present. He excused himself from the conversation with a brief nod and moved toward the front. His steps measured, controlled, as if giving himself time to decide something he had been circling around all day. Outside, Lily paused for a moment, her fingers hovering above the keyboard as she reread the final paragraph on her screen, her eyes scanning carefully, double-checking, making small adjustments. This was the part she could not rush, the part that mattered just as much as finishing. Her son shifted slightly in his sleep, and she instinctively rested her hand against his back, grounding both him and herself in the same quiet moment. Then she took a slow breath and pressed the final key, the document complete. She stared at the screen for a second, as if waiting for something to go wrong, something to interrupt the fragile success she had just reached, but nothing did. The screen remained steady, the work saved. The moment holding. Inside, Ethan reached the front door and paused, his hand resting lightly against the handle, his reflection staring back at him in the glass, layered over the image of her outside, two worlds overlapping in a way that no longer felt distant. He hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but because he understood that once he stepped through that door, something would change. The quiet distance that had defined everything so far would no longer exist, and whatever happened next would not be silent. Outside, Lily closed her laptop slowly, carefully placing it back into her bag, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if marking the end of something important. She exhaled softly, her shoulders finally releasing the tension they had carried all day. She looked down at her son, brushing her fingers gently through his hair, a small smile forming, tired but real, and for the first time since she had arrived that morning, she allowed herself to rest in that moment, unaware that just beyond the glass, someone had already decided that the distance between them would not remain untouched for much longer. The door opened with a soft sound that barely carried beyond the threshold, but to Lily Bennet, it felt louder than anything else that night. She looked up instinctively, her hand still resting lightly on her son's shoulder, her eyes adjusting to the shift between the glow of her screen and the warm light spilling out from inside the cafe. Ethan Cole stepped outside slowly, not rushed, not imposing. His presence calm and deliberate as he paused just a few feet away from her, leaving enough space to respect the invisible boundary she had kept all day. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet between them filled only by the distant hum of the city and the soft rustle of the night air. Lily straightened slightly, her posture instinctively guarded but not closed, her gaze steady as she tried to understand why he had come out. Not suspicious, just cautious in the way someone becomes after learning to expect nothing without reason. Ethan met her eyes with a calm expression, his voice low and even when he finally spoke, not loud enough to draw attention, but clear enough to carry intention. He said that she had been working out there all day, that the nights were getting colder, and that there was no rule saying she had to stay outside. His words were simple, without pressure, without expectation, just an observation. Offered as an option, Lily blinked once, processing the statement, her eyes shifting briefly toward the cafe behind him, the warm light, the empty seats, the space that had always felt just out of reach, then back to him. Her first instinct was hesitation, not because she did not understand the offer, but because she did. And understanding made it heavier. She shook her head gently at first, her voice soft but firm as she replied that she did not want to cause any trouble, that she was fine where she was, the response automatic, shaped by years of protecting herself from situations that could shift without warning. Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, but something in his posture softened, not retreating, just adjusting. He nodded once, acknowledging her response, then spoke again, this time not correcting her, but reframing what she had said. He told her that staying outside all day without asking for anything had already shown more respect than most people ever did, and that stepping inside would not be trouble, it would simply be a different place to sit. The simplicity of his words lingered for a second, not pushing, not persuading, just offering a perspective she had not been given before. Lily's gaze shifted again, this time lingering a little longer on the doorway behind him, the warmth visible, the quiet space waiting. She looked down at her son, still asleep, trusting, unaware, then back at Ethan, her hesitation still there, but something else now mixed with it, something quieter, something closer to possibility. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just enough to show the shift, and after a moment that stretched longer than it needed to, she nodded once, small, almost tentative, but real. Ethan stepped back slightly, giving her room, not reaching for her things, not crossing the space between them, just holding the door open as she gathered her bag and gently adjusted her son in her arms, her movements careful, protective. As she stood for the first time since early morning, her legs stiff but steady, and as she stepped forward, crossing the line she had held all day, the warmth from inside met her fully, wrapping around her in a way that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome, and for the first time, the glass between them was no longer a barrier, just a reflection fading quietly into the night. The warmth inside the cafe did not rush Lily Bennet all at once, it settled around her slowly, like something patient, something that understood she needed time to adjust. She stepped carefully across the floor, her arms holding her son close against her chest, his small body still wrapped in sleep, trusting, unaware that anything had changed. The soft light above reflected gently across her face, revealing details that had been hidden outside in the dim street glow, the faint lines of exhaustion, the quiet strength behind her eyes, and something else now, something softer, something that had not been there before. Ethan Cole closed the door behind her without a sound, not drawing attention, not turning the moment into anything larger than it needed to be. He simply gestured toward a table near the window. The same window she had sat beside for hours, but now from the other side. Lily hesitated for just a second, her gaze moving between the chair and the glass, as if acknowledging the distance she had crossed. Then she stepped forward and sat down slowly, adjusting her son carefully so he remained comfortable, her movements gentle, deliberate, she placed her bag beside her chair and exhaled. A quiet breath that seemed to carry the weight of the entire day with it. For a moment, she did not open her laptop, she did not move at all, she simply sat there, letting the warmth reach her, letting the silence exist without pressure. Inside, the cafe had grown quieter, the last few customers speaking in low tones, the staff moving in the background, respectful of the calm that had settled. Ethan remained nearby but not too close, giving her space, allowing the moment to belong to her rather than to him. Lily finally opened her eyes fully and looked down at her son, her fingers brushing lightly against his hair, a small smile forming, not out of relief alone, but out of something deeper, something that felt like recognition that even in a world that often overlooked her, there were still moments that made space without asking her to change who she was. She reached for her laptop again, not because she had to, but because she could, placing it on the table in front of her, the screen lighting up instantly, the connection steady, the environment quiet, everything aligning in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, yet completely right. Ethan watched from a distance, his expression calm, not expecting anything in return, not waiting for acknowledgement. Because that had never been the point had been the moment itself, the quiet shift from outside to inside, from cold to warmth, from distance to presence. And as Lily began typing again, her posture relaxed, her movements fluid, her son resting peacefully beside her, the reflection in the glass no longer showed two separate worlds, but one continuous space, soft and steady. And in that quiet continuity, something important settled, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that lasted. She had not asked for help, she had not crossed the line for comfort, she had simply shown up, again and again, with dignity that never demanded to be seen, and somehow, that had been enough to change where she belonged. And as the night carried on, gentle and unhurried, the story did not end with a grand gesture or a sudden transformation. It ended with something quieter, something stronger, a place at the table, a signal that did not fade, and a reminder that sometimes, the world does not change all at once, sometimes it changes just enough for one person to finally be seen. And if this moment stayed with you, if you have ever felt invisible and kept going anyway, then maybe this story was meant for you, and maybe sharing it, or simply leaving your thoughts, is a way of reminding someone else that being seen can begin in the quietest ways.